I think we'll have some other people probably join us in process, but we'll get the evening going. So first of all, I'd like to say welcome and thank you for joining us in the first of a series of summer webinars on various topics related to church development. And if we just go to the next slide, we'll see these are going to be held every 2 weeks, 6:30 to 8 o'clock, and you can eat dinner in the background or do whatever you normally do at this time. And we're going to pull everything together with a session on September 11th, which will be an opportunity for everybody to come together, talk about in smaller groups some of what they've heard or seen during the course of the summer in the first session. And we will then summarize at that session how parishes can move forward. So tonight, the agenda you can see. Jason McKinney is going to open us up with a welcome and a prayer and a little bit reminder of the theology of land from the first session. And then Tim Dickau is going to be with us. We're going to have a Q&A session that will start sooner than 7:45. Tim has actually got a slightly shorter presentation to allow more time for questions and answers. How do you do question and answer? We're going to ask if questions come up as you go along. There is the chat function at the bottom of your screen. If you sort of move your cursor, you can see that. And just click on that and type your questions in there, and we will be able to then address them through Lynn Golden will be our moderator at the end of the evening. And there may be some questions to have direct dialogue with Tim as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Jason.
Great, thank you, Rob. Nice to see everyone here tonight. I'm not going to do things exactly in the order that they're listed there, but I am going to start with a word of prayer. So let us pray. Gracious God, we pray this evening for openness, for courage, and for imagination as we consider how to be good stewards of the gift of land. Let us pursue right relations with this land, with our neighbors, and with all who inhabit this land. Reconcile us to yourself, O God, as we seek to be reconcilers. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
And let's also acknowledge the land that I suspect most of us anyway are on. I know Tim is coming from different territory, but most of us within the Diocese of Toronto acknowledge that we are situated on the lands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat Nation. This land is the territory of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt, a treaty between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee Nation to peacefully share and sustain life in and around the Great Lakes. We acknowledge the many treaties that cover different areas of our diocese and the ways in which these agreements to mutually share and sustain our sacred life together have been broken both by the church and government. As we gather today, we acknowledge the leadership of Indigenous elders who continue to teach us about what it means to live in a balanced and good way with all creation. May our time together be blessed as we give respect to the first peoples of this land and seek to live in right relationships with ourselves, Creator, and one another. And thank you, Lydia. So just by way of reminder, I think most of you were here for the first session. The first session, at least my bit of that, was to lay a bit of a theological framework as we think about these various real and potential redevelopment projects. And what I suggested in that framework is that we need to think about a theology of land, I called it urban land, not in the sense you have to live in the city, but in the sense that we're dealing with the built environment. It needs to be thought of in the context in which we find ourselves, which is the situation of a capitalist land regime. The way that our world tends to understand the land is that it is held as property, that it is owned by right, and that it is exchanged as a commodity. And beyond that, the way that we got to this model or this understanding of land was through a historic and continued processes of displacement. Then I suggested that there is another way of thinking about land. Scripture does not give us a singular view of what that is, but in the dialogue or the conversation between the situation in which we find ourselves and our engagement with Scripture and tradition, we might come up with a different way of relating to land. I suggested that in Scripture and tradition, land is understood to be held as a gift, to be transferred as inheritance, and to be shared as a common. So I'm not going to go over the whole thing, but what I do want to do prior to Tim is also going to lead us in some theological reflection, but just to dig a little bit deeper into the first one of those. What does it mean for the land to be held as a gift? And I'm going to suggest there are three implications that come from that. The first is that if we affirm the reality of creation, as we do in the church, then we must also affirm that the most original and fundamental relation to the land is one of generosity. And that generosity precedes any other relation, including those of appropriation and acquisitiveness. The idea that what really matters about the land is who owns or possesses the land is a very European and a very modern phenomenon. In fact, even within the European tradition, up until the 17th century, theories of property always began with the premise that the earth was originally created for the good of all. Even thinkers like John Locke, will work out from that premise to what I consider a problematic, but an argument anyway, for private appropriation of land. But at least he begins with that understanding that the earth is a gift for all of creation. And we find a similar sentiment in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And I'll just read that 2403, that catechism for you, because I think it's relevant. It says, the right to private property acquired or received in a just way does not do away with the original gift of the earth to the whole of humankind. The universal destination of goods remains primordial, even if the promotion of the common good requires respect for the right to private property and its exercise. So in the church, we have a responsibility, A, to be good stewards of the land, but also to be good holders of that deeper memory of the primordial giftedness of creation. Because in our world, I think that the giftedness of creation and of land is easily and often forgotten. And in that regard, we have a lot to learn from Indigenous communities in particular. The second thing about land understood as gift in Scripture and tradition is that the gift is not irrevocable. The land can be taken back, or that land can be held in bad faith. So just because we claim that the land is a gift to us doesn't actually make it so. And in the context of ancient Israel, the gift of the land in the form of wealth, in the form of a home, in the form of a source of food, was always contingent upon covenant obedience. I would suggest that you read Leviticus 26 to get a sense of what that means, but it is very conditional. The productivity of the land is conditional on the following of the covenant. And likewise, on the other side, if covenant is not followed, it says in verse 20, your land will not give its produce, and the trees of the land will not give their fruit. So for us today, we are authorized by Scripture and tradition to speak about land as gift. But if we do, we are also obliged to enter into that generosity that is the primordial nature of creation and to just care for that land. And finally, receiving land as a gift implicates us in the gift economy. So what I mean is that a gift cuts both ways. A gift is both received and given. So if we're going to claim that our church properties, for instance, are gifts from God, I'm not sure if we're prepared to make that claim, although we can certainly make the claim that many of those properties are gifts of the Crown. But if we are to understand our land as a gift, then we should also be ready to give that gift as readily as we were ready to receive it. So speaking in my own voice and not as a representative of the Diocese of Toronto, I do believe there is a good reason to consider gifts or transfers of land, in particular to Indigenous communities, as a form of just care. I'm not talking about a blanket liquidation of church properties, but in particular strategic cases and for the sake of right relations, I think this shouldn't be off the table, because as St. Paul tells us, it is more blessed to give than to receive. So that was a bit of a deeper dig into the idea of land as gift. I'm hoping in the further sessions to dig a little more deeply into the idea of land as commons and land as transferred normatively as inheritance. But it's at this point that I'm going to hand things over to my friend, Tim Dickau. Tim is going to take us for the rest of the evening to tell you a little bit about him. Tim served as the pastor of Grandview Calvary Baptist Church in Vancouver in the Commercial Drive area for over 20 years. And it was under his leadership that the church undertook the Cohere housing project. And we're going to hear more about Cohere. Tim is currently a writer and director of the Citygate Leadership Forum in Vancouver. And he's going to talk to us a little bit more about how he helped to transform a struggling downtown church into an active neighborhood-focused community that has since made a significant impact on the affordable housing problem in Vancouver. So it's over to you, Tim.
Well, thanks, Jason. It's a real privilege to be with you tonight. Such a valuable topic, and one that I'm really grateful that all of you are thinking about and willing to take time on a Wednesday evening in July to talk about. And so thanks for that. I want to do a few things tonight. I'm going to tell you about 3 different housing projects that Grandview's been involved in. One is Cohere that Jason mentioned, that's built over top of our church parking lot and involved in entire community development. Another one is Kinbrace, which are 2 houses side by side which welcome refugee claimants. And then I want to tell you a bit about our own experience and many other people's, including a whole city block where people are living in houses adjacent to one another, or homes adjacent to one another, and trying to develop a shared life of hospitality with their neighbors. And so 3 different pictures of things you might consider when you think about housing. Before we look at those responses, I want to build upon what Jason has talked about here and talk a little bit about why place matters. Why place matters. I just recently published a book called Forming Christian Communities in a Secular Age, and I looked at these 7 powers that you can see on your screen here. None of them will come as any big revelation to you, but in the book I try and paint the picture of why these together form a formidable foe when it comes to living out the vision of God's renewed world that we find in the Gospels. And so I want to tell you that part of our story is an attempt to resist these powers and to find a different way of living as a community of people. And I think these powers, when we look at them, they expose why it is that we struggle to take God seriously, relying particularly upon Charles Taylor's philosophy and explanation of how we got to this point where it's so easy not to believe in God. And they also reveal why common practices and a commitment to place are so vital for being the church today. And I think that's true before COVID, and I think it's going to be more true post-COVID. Let me just start there with a little bit about COVID. Like many of you, I imagine you've started to have, I'm guessing, more frequent conversations with neighbors that are physically located closely to you. And perhaps you've shopped closer to home with local merchants, and perhaps you begin walking around your neighborhood. I know Mary and I have had a chance to do that almost every day. And when you do that, you notice things I think that you didn't notice before: architecture, certain places of beauty or brokenness in your own neighborhoods. And I believe this move to the local is a good thing. British parliamentarian Maurice Glassman says globalization was committed to the untrammeled movement of people as directed by the demands of the market. Social isolation from the pandemic moved the focus back to the local and to the workers, without which the whole system does not operate. I want to use geographic terms too to distinguish between space and place. And so my understanding is that geographers speak of space as something more abstract, something without substantial meaning, the space we view, or move within. But place refers to how people are aware of or attracted to certain pieces of space. A place can be seen as a space that has meaning. And being a nation of commuters and consumers, many of us don't really inhabit a place. And we work in a particular part of the city. We often, quote, go to church in another part of town. We shop across town. We don't inhabit a place, and certainly we usually don't do that together. And commuter culture kind of puts us into a no person's land where we're untethered from community and place. And what's the allure of space over place? Well, when we choose space over place, we believe we're choosing the path of freedom. But we're increasingly shaped by technology that promises liberation from limits of place, time, and even identity. And Patrick Deneen argues that this is part of the reason that so many people feel rootless. In the Bible, freedom is never just a freedom from. It's a freedom for God and for others and for the vocation that God's created us to take up. So the spiritual life is a rooted life, a concrete, embodied life. We're free to live into an actual embodied life. And I love this quote from Simone Weil, who says, "To be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. It's one of the hardest to define. A human being has roots by virtue of his or her real, active, and natural participation in the life of a community, which preserves in living shape certain particular treasures of the past and certain particular expectations about the future." Wonder what it would mean for us to reimagine freedom, less about me and less restrictions on my life, and more about us, and more about choosing the rooted, specific, concrete over the abstract. So a word about a theology of place. One of the things that really I've noticed so much more in reading the Bible is that the places matter. Places matter. I mean, have you ever heard a sermon about the name of a place? We don't usually focus on that because we don't think of places as being that significant as they are in Scripture. But the Bible tells us clearly that God cares about places. Rootedness is in place is part of the biblical story from the beginning. God gives place as a gift, as Jason mentioned, and a way to know God. Humans are given Eden, the first home, the land, a place to steward and work in concert with God and with each other. And then the Hebrew people are given a place to live out God's vision for humanity for the sake of the whole world. Places are sites of meaning where significant things happen, and that place carries that story. Jen Pollock, I like this quote. She says, "The incarnation is the death of abstraction." God becoming human, taking on flesh in a particular place, just brings to importance the value of a particular place and time. And again, this quote from Brueggemann: "Place is space which has historical meanings. where some things have happened which are now remembered and which provide continuity and identity across generations. Place is a space in which important words have been spoken, which have established identity, defined vocation, and envisioned destiny. Place is a space in which vows have been exchanged, promises have been made, and demands have been issued. Place is indeed a protest against the unpromising pursuit of space. Living in one neighborhood with a group of people over 30 years, I've just come to realize how important that was for our own journey as a church, and to realize that this place matters to God and that it will need to matter to us. A few things have happened in our journey as a church because of taking place more seriously. One is that it has brought an integration into our life together and a collective empowerment together. And this is a quote from the first book I wrote, where I try to describe the first 20 years of our journey at Grandview. And I wrote there, living, working, shopping, using services, engaging in recreation, hanging out, and participating in a common neighborhood all bring a new level of integration into our fragmented lives. Interconnections emerge which give people a greater sense of being known and rooted, reweaving isolated, fragmented lives into a healthier whole. These interconnections, often unplanned, serendipitous, and transforming, lead to stability and to fraternity, and to a collective energy that can empower you to participate in seeking God's kingdom and the common good in a place. Geography is not incidental. It is the spatial anticipation of the things to come, a tangible sign of God's kingdom come on earth as in heaven. There was just such a goodness of, we'd go to the store and you'd see people from your church, and you'd see the people you're getting to know from the work in the store, neighbors that come to the store, and just inhabiting a place like that is the beginning of being able to imagine a different kind of future, I think, for that place. And then, of course, one of the great gifts of inhabiting a neighborhood is you start to notice those who are not included well. And I love this quote, one great reason why the rich in general have so little sympathy for the poor is because they seldom visit them. Hence it is that one part of the world does not know what the other suffers. Inhabiting a place helps us to see and notice all the people who are there, especially those that are dealing with poverty. And then thirdly, inhabiting a place, along with some systemic analysis, and we had the gift of people that can do that sort of thing in our community, it can open your eyes to see who isn't belonging in your neighborhood, and for whom your neighborhood is not working very well. And certainly in our own journey as a church, I began to see that as we started to connect with single mothers who made up about a quarter of the population of our neighborhood, and just recognizing how the poverty levels for single mothers in particular was so high, and started to see how society wasn't really supporting single parents very well. Or we started, as we became friends with Indigenous neighbors, to try and help them find a place to live, and just seeing them refused at the door and realizing, okay, there are things going on here that are bigger than just this individual here that we need to attend to in this place. Let me tell you a little bit about housing in Vancouver. As a prelude to talk a little bit about our own responses. So this chart tells you in Vancouver just the craziness with which housing has gone. So a single detached home, as low as even 1989, around 200 grand, now about 1.8 million in Toronto. You could have a similar graph there. This gives you some more detail. 2005, an average house in East Vancouver, single detached, was $450, and now you can see that it's 1.5. there's some specific features in Vancouver that make housing prices what they are. Our landlocked nature, the destination for international immigrants. Again, some of these have similarities with Toronto, with the lakes and so forth. Low interest rates for a long time, demolition of old housing and apartment stock, our provincial government decisions, the lack of a federal housing policy between 1994 and 2017, and the decreasing amount of social housing built in our province. And again, going back to Jason's beginning parts there, it's this cultural mindset that views housing primarily as a commodity, that the market should regulate unfettered by government policies. That kind of vision doesn't help us when we try and build and have affordable housing. And of course, many of the policies that government makes incentivize new construction or speculation. So government does have an impact on these realities. And then, of course, the widening picture for me, one of the books that was really helpful was Thomas Piketty's Capitalism in the 21st Century, and just looking at his longitudinal study over a 200-year period, noticing that families with capital generally retain and increase their wealth, widening the gap of economic and social inequality. And so the myth of the self-made millionaire is by far the exception to the rule. And while there have been periods where income inequality has reduced somewhat during the wars, for example, for the most part, the trends towards inequality continue to rise. And Piketty warns that it may increase more rapidly over the next 50 years. And recently, an MIT grad named Matthew Rucknall has revised this thesis by demonstrating how housing is the chief asset that works in the manner that Piketty describes. Secure housing and housing reform are keys to spreading wealth around and narrowing this wealth gap. Over half of Vancouverites under 40 said that they want to leave Vancouver or intend to leave Vancouver because they can't afford to live there. And so our cities, our big cities, especially in the core, are becoming uninhabitable for so many people, and especially the poor. Okay, so that's a little bit of the background I wanted to provide to tell you a little bit more about our own response as a community. And what I want to encourage you to think about are some different possibilities. One is to develop church properties, to use church properties to develop affordable housing. I'm going to tell you one of those stories. I'm going to talk about how you might pool resources for one house for a specific group that needs secure housing. And that's something that we did with Kinbrace and with the foundation that was a family that had a foundation that was part of our church. Welcome people to live with you in your home. Somebody said that the big problem in housing in Vancouver is not a lack of housing, it's too many empty bedrooms. And so this notion that, our houses are not our own just private property, they are gifts, and that we need to be thinking about how to steward our homes as well. And then, of course, to work at this systemic level to advocate for and support government decisions and policies that view housing as a basic human right rather than a commodity for making profit from. So those are the kinds of stories I want to tell you about as I tell you more about our own responses at Grandview. So when I think about our journey as a church, one way to think about this is that we tried to move from being a consumer model of church where, you're a dispenser of religious goods and services and you try and provide the best programs so that people will come to your church, kind of an attractional model. And we tried to become a missional church, and that word has a lot of baggage for some people, but the idea of being moving from going to church to being the church in a particular place. That was the vision that we tried to live into as we moved along and made these different responses. I think COVID's really exposed weaknesses in the attractional model of the church, and for the most part, it doesn't form thicker community. It doesn't energize for mission or deeply transform people. It doesn't usually take parish or place seriously. And it certainly doesn't challenge these powers that I named at the beginning for the most part. And so we need other models of ways of being the church in cities that resist these forces and live into something that is more reflective of God's vision for humanity. Let me tell you a little bit about the process of getting going towards some of these things that we did. So this is kind of the first 10 years of our journey. Mary and I came in 1989. We were 26 years old, and most of the people were, average age was about 66. So we were ready to roll, and they were ready to retire for the most part. But they were a great lot of folks, and they had what I would call a healthy institutional vision, where they wanted the church to flourish in some way, even if they weren't sure how they could be a part of it or if they would be a part of it. And they gave a lot of time and energy to the work that we started to do. So I appreciated that generation a great deal. Two questions we asked. I was hired by the denomination to help to see if we could bring renewal to this church. And so I went around and just talked to whoever I could, saying, what are the needs of this neighborhood? How do you think our church could help? And then tried to find ways with the 40 or 50 people that were part of the church to communicate what I was learning and to have people, we had people come and speak. They came with me when we went around and talked to people sometimes. We did a whole bunch of things to learn about the neighborhood. And then the pastor who was there retired. I became the pastor a year after I arrived, and away we went at trying to get connected there. And one of the first things we started was a parents group, because we had a young son when we arrived, a 6-month-old, and shortly after that had another son, and so we needed friends. And so I was at the park one night, and this woman said, "Hey, there's no parents group here in this neighborhood. What should we do about that?" And I said, "Well, hey, we got this church hall. We could do something there." And we started that, and that became a beginning point for making connections in the neighborhood. I did the child care. I was the first child care person in that group, and I remember when we first got started, there were 10 boys that I was taking care of. Would take them to the park, and hoping that they all came back. This was before liability policies or anything like that. But these are some of the beginning ways that we began to build community in the neighborhood. And then the church went through a revisioning process in my 4th year. And this was really important. And I just to say that the process was really important. So we met in small groups for 6 weeks, looking at, where has God been involved in our journey? What's happening now? Where do you think God's leading us? And then we brought that all together on a Sunday morning and shared it. And then we interviewed everybody in the church individually. And church had grown a bit. There's probably about 80 people by this time. And that was really important. That said, we value what you have to say. And at the same time, there's an accountability that comes with that too, that we all have a part to play in this. Slowly, we started to develop a shared life and common practices together around hospitality being an important one, and another one is sharing life across differences. The neighborhood was a welcoming neighborhood at that time for low-income immigrants and refugees, and we started to connect with a lot of those folks. And at one point, about 15 years in, we had people from 34 different countries of origin that were part of the church, and that became part of its DNA, this diversity. We also had to work through dysfunction. We had a couple major problems. A woman who was an entrepreneur ended up leaving the church and taking people with her. We had a fellow from Mexico that was helping us connect with a lot of the Spanish-speaking refugees and immigrants. He left. We didn't do a very good job integrating him. He left and took half the Spanish-speaking folks. And so there was some major dysfunction we had to work through. And when I was doing my doctoral thesis, I came across a study by a fellow named Israel Galindo, who said that on average it takes 10 years for renewal to take root. And when I read that, I was 40 years old, I thought, 10 years, that's like forever. And then I looked and realized he described to a T what happened in the first 10 years at Grandview. And I thought, okay, let's remember this, that it takes time to build a community in a place. So one of the first collective responses that we made was the Crossroads Community Meal. And that happened when I was at a neighborhood services team meeting with other health and education, social service professionals, somebody asked me, Tim, what are the churches doing for the increasing number of homeless people on Commercial Drive? And I said, nothing that I know of. Brought that story back to our community on Sunday. Said, if you're interested, let's talk about this. About 15 people gathered. We researched and really copied out of the cold from Toronto, and started a community meal and overnight shelter on Thursday nights. That has continued on to this day, and that's been one of those, sociologists call third places, where they're not public, they're not private, but they're safe places where people can meet together and get to know each other. And that has been a meeting place across economic and cultural differences for many people in our community. When at the same time, we were also exploring the possibility of living together, and Salisbury Community Society was established about that time, 24 years ago. So Salisbury was established when there was a seniors home 5 blocks north of the church building where we did monthly services there, and it was being sold. And this family that had a foundation that invested in housing was looking at buying it, and we were going to establish a community of people there. As it turns out, the city was going to require seismic upgrading if it changed use from a seniors home to a community living space. And we used to joke that the city didn't mind if it fell down on seniors, but they didn't want it falling down on young people. And of course, if you're in urban planning, it's a lot more complicated than that. But we then got this idea, partly from Charles and Rita Ringma, who became part of our church at that time, the idea of building little communities in homes in physical proximity to each other. And so we started with this house, which is right next to our church building. The church owned 2 houses right next to it. We were living in this house at the time. We moved to a house a block away, and these 2 houses and 2 other houses became the first community houses at Salisbury, where people lived together and then had used the other rooms to welcome others who were more vulnerable. That became a path that many people in the Grandview Community Church took. Now some of the community living is driven by economics. Then it was driven more by vision, and we've always said that economics is not enough to sustain community living. You need a vision of sharing life together and taking up common practices together that will sustain you in that journey. Those polka dots in the house, nobody really knows who did that. It happened one night in the middle of the night, and that was after we moved out of that house, so it wasn't me. That's all I can say. Another 2 houses that are side by side are Kinbrace. And Kinbrace offers support for refugee claimants, so people who are making a refugee claim at the Canadian border. And there's 10 suites in these 2 houses, and people stay there through their refugee hearings, and then they're helped to find more permanent housing if they get a positive determination, or helped on their way home if they don't. And so these homes there have been over 400 people that have been welcomed into Kinbrace, and they've been a really important source of helping the church to care for refugee claimants. Kinbrace too, really quickly, has had a systemic impact across Canada, because they started both tours of the law courts, the refugee law courts, for tours that have been for refugees that have been picked up across Canada. And they also developed a new refugee guide, because the government one was so hard to use and read, that has been translated into multiple language and used across Canada. And that's because they really paid attention to what was going on in their own work and in the lives of the people they work with. Jason told me that you saw, so those of you that were here last month saw a little video about the formation of Cohere. Cohere began when we bought a house next door to our parking lot, where we were going to move our drop-in center that we'd established just a few houses from the church building. As it turns out, we got a bad inspection on that house, and it had to be torn down, eventually, and we had a community garden there for many years, and then we began to envision as a church what we might do. And already in the early 2000s, we were committing to housing. Initially, we were going to partner with another organization to develop housing, and then they said to us, no, we think your vision is a little bit different from ours and that you should do it yourselves. And because part of our vision was this idea of having people live together across economic boundaries and barriers as we'd had in our other community housing. And so that we started developed a foundation, the Cohere Foundation, and then began to work at this project. It took about 13, 14 years, way too long, and the Cohere is now pivoting to become an organization that helps other churches develop affordable housing, because we want to shorten that time frame and think it could happen in 3 to 5 years if you've got some good people around you to help you in the journey, which we didn't. We were learning a lot by trial and error. It's a beautiful building. There's underground parking, mostly for the church, because most people in social housing don't have vehicles and don't need parking. We retained some of the community gardens, as you can see. There are 26 units, bachelors, 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom suites. They're all independent units, but we designed the building partly based on the interviews we did with people that were living on or near the street about what they would value in a home. And one of the things people said is, oh, it'd be neat to have some space in between a few apartments where you could just kind of a living room where you could come out and hang out together, since they're all quite small apartments. And so we did that. Every 5 units opens up into common kind of living room. And you can imagine if you're a parent or single parent, and just to be able to put your child to sleep and then to step out and have some adult conversation in the joint living room, those are some real gifts of the architecture. The main floor is all community space. It has a commercial kitchen, dining room, living room, and some office space as well. And so that building has been one that has been getting a lot of attention, because BC Housing is now promoting this. In fact, I'm speaking to all the BC Housing employees next Wednesday, talking about our project and about how to think about mixed housing in a new way. One other piece that we developed, not to do with housing, but it's been really significant, and I thought I'd tell this one partly because Jason's wife Sandra was involved in the pottery studio in the basement of our church. We developed a social enterprise developer that has a pottery business, a catering business, and a rental business that employs about 35 people, and many of them on disability, and so they can earn up to $800 a month without reducing any of their benefits. And not only is it an economic boost for people, but just the meaning of having meaningful work is, we're created for that. And so it's been a significant piece to add on to housing and the community, that together those have really formed a solid basis for people getting their feet back on the ground. Living hospitably, embracing the poor, inhabiting a neighborhood, all these have been part of Grandview's journey, and I think are really valuable lessons that we've learned. And I love this quote from Stanley Hauerwas. He says, "Shalom takes time, and it doesn't happen overnight." And so we need a kind of theological vision that will take us into these areas because we're thinking longer term. I spent a week with the Jesuits in Guelph, and they have, some of you, if you've been there, know they have a 500-year plan for their the forest around them. And I'm thinking, what churches, what denominations have a 500-year plan? If we get a 2-year plan, we're thinking we're doing pretty well. I think we need this vision of a theological vision of living towards God's vision for the world over the long haul. I think another piece that's been really valuable in our story is holding together personal and communal transformation with systemic transformation. And that, again, is something that I think can only happen if you do this over the long haul, and if you take place seriously, you're going to be able to hold those together. These are 4 trajectories that I talk about in the first book that I wrote. And again, if you're interested in the process of how we move through these things, especially in the early years, that book, Plunging into the Kingdom Way, is one that you might find helpful. All right, that's a bit of drinking from the fire hose, everybody. But I didn't want to talk the whole time. I wanted to have space for questions and responses. So I'll let Ellen curate this time for us now.
Sure. Hi, Livia, if you can stop sharing so that we can see everybody, that would be great. Thanks. Well, we didn't have a lot of questions per se in the chat. We had a couple of comments. One was that just a very appreciative comment and very grateful to have registered and can't wait to hear more. And another comment that Kinbrace, the model that of the Kinbrace housing sounds very similar to that of Romero House here in Toronto.
It's very
And there's a lot of similarities. But since we have a fair bit of time, and we have about we have not a huge number of people, if anybody wants to speak, would you please? There should be a little thing at the bottom that allows you to raise your hand. It's got a little hand-shaped icon, and you can raise your hand, and then that will put you up to the top, and I will call on you. So there's Graham Cubitt has raised his hand.
Yeah, hi, and thanks very much for the presentation, Tim. My wife and I, Emma, were in Vancouver as the building was being constructed at Cohere, and so it was neat to sort of like look at it through the construction fencing. Congratulations on getting it done. I wonder if you would be able to speak a bit about how the church financed or funded the project, and ideas or inspiration or barriers that you maybe could identify as as what others could maybe experience in trying to do something similar.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. That's a great question. So we got a jump start when the Hawthorne Foundation, which was the foundation that was connected to our church, the Bental family, they sold one of our community houses that they had bought because it had kind of reached the end of its life and needed a lot of work and so forth. And they put that 1.5 million into the project. And that was a huge boost to the project to help it get going. Another family from our church, they sold their family business. They put in $1 million, and so we were able to get some real gifts to get us going. The church, of course, donated the land, which was worth about $2 million at that time. It's probably worth about double that now, and so we had a fair bit to start with. Then we went along. We raised a little bit more money, but we got to a point where we were about halfway there, and we had about a year left or two of construction. And then we'd been dialoguing with BC Housing, and at that point they realized, okay, we can put the rest of this money in, and it's a good deal for the province because we're only paying a third of what we would if we tried to do this ourselves, of buying the land and overseeing all the construction, paying for it. So they put in the last $4 million, and we were able to build the building without any debt, which is part of the reason it functions. It's sustainable because the incomes not only sustain the repairs and upkeep of the building, but they sustain 2 staff people from Salisbury Community Society who help to facilitate the community life there.
That's really helpful. Thanks.
It's so helpful to have people who understand their money, who have money and financial resources, who understand it is not as a means to power to try and fix things, but a gift to enter into relationship with a community of people. Howard and Shirley Bento, when they came to our church, said, "Tim, we've set aside $2 million over the long term for Grandview. And as people and as vision emerge, let us know and we'll give." And it never was more than 20 or 30,000 that they gave usually for these things, except for certain capital purchases. But it was the seed money that got things going. When seed money is so hard because you haven't got anything to show people that you've done yet, and they provided that seed money, and then that helped things to flourish along. So if you have money or know people with money, there's things to learn from people who enter into this as relationship so well.
I see that Patricia has a question. I have another one that has come through in the chat, but you go ahead, Patricia.
Thanks, Elin. Tim, thank you for your talk. I'm curious to know if you've had any dealings with Canada Mortgage and Housing since the National Housing Strategy was announced in 2017.
Yeah. Well, we didn't with the Cohere project, but we have definitely had lots of dialogue with them, with churches that Cohere is beginning to have conversation with about developing their own properties. And so definitely, I see that as they're going to become an important partner in churches that are wanting to develop affordable housing using their own land assets, for sure.
And Martha has her hand up.
Hi, Tim. I think it's a great presentation. I work with many churches, and what I'm finding is people have the will to do something like this, and they may even have the money. But what they struggle with is the actual manpower to get it done. Lady power, woman power, people power.
Yep.
To just, to do something like this and to manage it once it's been set up. So I know that can cost money, or it could have been. Did you find that that was in-house? You already had that, the will and the support of people to do this work, to get it set up? It's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work, Martha. That's a great question. And we had a few things going for us. One is that we had learned a lot about community living through Salisbury and the multiplication of community homes. And so a lot of us, like our family, had lived with 30 some people over the previous 20 years, and so we had that experience that to bring into community living, and so we could support. It made sense to us, the project, and we could offer kind of support to it along those lines. Secondly, because of the 300 people that were part of the church, 70% lived within walking distance of the church. This was not, just the church's project. This was the project in the neighborhood that I live in, and there's a different feel to that and an energy that comes with that, and so that helped provide strength and energy to it as well. This is the thing that BC Housing says. They love our model. They just said, but how do you build a community that's going to support this community? And that is one of the things we had. We had a community of people that already had a shared life that could then contribute to this building. The other thing is that our church had a mindset of creating things, and this was partly, I think, from me being kind of having an entrepreneurial kind of vision. And at some point, a few years ago, I reached a place of burnout, and I think the church reached a little bit of a place of burnout too. We created too much, and we needed perhaps other kind of leadership. But this entrepreneurial spirit really helped the church to take the risks in some of these areas as well, and not to be afraid to try them. So those would be some of the things I'd say, Martha.
Thank you so much.
The next person is Jason, who I actually think had his hand up earlier, but he has a very pale hand avatar and I couldn't see it against the white background. So
I've had lots of time to talk tonight. It's fine. So my question's related to Martha's. It's one that I've put to Tim before, but maybe if Tim can have an opportunity to reflect on it in this wider context. But I have a sense that many of the churches represented here look more like Grandview when you first arrived than when you built Cohere.
Yep.
And just wondering what your thoughts are in terms of moving to redevelopment projects and affordable housing and engaging in that kind of work without taking that step of community building in the way that you have done it, and whether or not we need to rethink how we're potentially engaging that process.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's potential for doing this in a different order. Um, I think there's potential for churches to become rerouted and renewed in their neighborhoods by building housing that provides a home for people with less income, but also provides a home where some people from your church or people that could be part of your church would move in and reestablish the church's incarnational presence in that place. So I think that there could be a different order to the journey than what Grandview had. I mean, when we built that place, we had hundreds of people that we were connected with that we were wanting to find a place to live, and lots of people that wanted to move into the building who had more income to help be that incarnational presence. So that we didn't lack that. But I think for other churches, it might be a way to reestablish your presence in a neighborhood and to become rerouted in a neighborhood. And so I'm curious about that as Cohere works with other communities now. We're pitching that vision and encouraging churches to think along those lines. But we don't have we don't have stories yet to tell of whether and how that's worked. But I'm curious to see if that could work in that order. I think there's things you want to be doing regardless of the order you come at this, whether you build or rebuild the community first and then do housing, or rebuild housing as a way of helping to rekindle the renewal of community. And those are, listening to neighbors. And that is just in talking with your neighbors around the building and making a commitment to be connected to the neighbors around your building. That to me is just essential. I don't know how I could pastor a church if I didn't live in that neighborhood, if I wanted it to become a community church. So listening to neighbors and building relationships there. I think involving your neighbors in in a vision of how of developing affordable housing. A lot of our neighbors were resistant to the housing project, and they spoke pretty loudly at City Hall when we went through our rezoning process. But a number of our neighbors were highly committed to this, and they became volunteers in the project, and it was a way of weaving them into the life of our church because they people want to contribute to something that makes a difference for good in our neighborhood. They're looking for those opportunities, and so how do we involve them from the beginning? And so it's not just like the church is us and them out there, but we're inviting people into a journey with us of forming housing for our neighbors. Good question.
I have two more people with hands up, Peter Masson and Andrea Ruddy, and I also have a question that came to me in the chat. So we'll take those and then we'll see where we're at in terms of timing. So Peter, go ahead.
Peter, yeah, there you go.
There you go.
Yeah, Tim, I think you probably answered or anticipated my question when you talked about neighbors. But what I wanted to do was to ask you about the journey through the zoning process that you must have encountered, resistance, and finally acceptance. It must have been an interesting tour.
Yeah, it was, Peter. I'll tell you a little bit of that story because it's a good one, actually. So, the city requires that you do certain things with your neighbors, like you have open house and look at models, and so that they're involved in the process. And then we established a committee for neighbors that were interested and had feedback about the project. And of course, that tends to attract the neighbors that have the negative feedback. And so we had that little group, and they were pretty strong. And again, so much the importance is not to be defensive in those kinds of meetings. You can push back, but being defensive. And I learned this early on, like 15 years earlier, when we were going to establish a drop-in center in Commercial Drive, and there were 200 people showed up because word got out that it was going to be mostly a place for drug users. And anyways, it was all schmozzle, and I got really defensive and learned the hard way of how useless that is. And so if you can just listen, but speak back truth as well in those kinds of contexts. Because we did that work, I think, relatively well, when we got to the rezoning hearing, they had 60 speakers that night. And 30 of them were people from the church who lived in the neighborhood speaking for it. Then there were 15 people who opposed it in the neighborhood. And then there were 15 people not connected with our church who came to speak in favor of the project. And including the first ever community choir that they had come and sing for our project. And so that was quite a memorable night for many of the city councilors. But in the go-round afterwards, when they voted, it was unanimous in favor of the project, the rezoning. And the people said things like, this is a miracle that church would give its land, and this is exactly what churches should be doing. We have that 15 minutes of tape because it was such a meaningful time, and it just really affirmed both the process we went through of listening without being defensive, and yet at the same time moving forward and not letting those negative voices derail the project. Because I have had 5 of those people that spoke against it come and tell me they were wrong. And since then, and to say that this is a really good project. So.
Well done.
That's so encouraging. Thank you. Andrea Ruddy has your hand up.
Hi, so I've got 2 unrelated questions. The first is I was wondering what the resources were. So when you did the development, did you use the parking lot, but did you lose your church building in the process? Or did you choose to give up your church building in the process? And my second question is, you're talking about getting to know your neighbors. If you're located in an urban center where you're surrounded by a lot of high rises, it seems like there's difficulty getting to know your neighbors in that. Are any suggestions? And what kind of residential area were you located in?
Yeah, great questions, Andrea. I'm going to do the second one first. I have said that there were some real gifts of getting to know your neighbors in the Granby Woodlands area where I live. There's a lot of single detached houses with front porches. Suburbs don't have front porches generally. That's a great gift. We had a lot of 3-4-story level apartments, and those feel a little bit different for getting to know people than in a high rise. We lived in a high rise when we first moved to Vancouver and found it very difficult to get to know our neighbors. And there's just a lot of fear because you live so close that you're going to invade my life somehow if I get to know you, and so those are challenging environments, and I've often said I'm not the one to give answers to those questions because I haven't had to do it. So if anybody lives in a high rise and has done a good job of developing community in it, write a book because I haven't read any. Your first question. Just remind me again your first question.
It was about your space. So did you use your parking lot? Did you use your, did you end up giving up your whole church building in order to construct the housing? Or did you have a combination?
We didn't have to because our parking lot was about a block from our church building and across the street. And so our church building is on 2 lots on First Avenue, and then just kitty corner from that, the parking lot was on 3 lots. And so, no, we didn't have to, it didn't affect our church building at all, which is different than for most people, right? Because it's all integrated land. So we had 3 empty surface parking lot spaces, and then we bought this house next door that we tore down. So we had basically, it was 4 lots that we could use. And then we built the underground parking partly for a few spaces, all right, for the building itself, but most of those spaces were replacing the surface parking spaces of our parking lot, and the city required us to have some parking spaces for our church building, even though most people walked to our church. And so that was how we dealt with the parking issue, and that's how we could develop that land without worrying about it impacting our worship spaces.
Thanks so much, Tim. I have a question that I have from the chat was and you've touched on it a little bit already with your response to Jason, but it sounds like it took a long time to move your congregation through the process and then come around to building the project. Is there anything that you would learn that you would do differently, or that could, I know I'm understanding what you're saying about Shalom takes time and you can't skimp on the community building, but is there anything that, any lessons that you would have learned that you would do differently?
Well, in Cohere's work now with other churches, we talk about getting to base camp, and that's Cohere's aim, is to help churches get to base camp, so that then they can go on to hire architects to do drawings, to look at hiring a general contractor and moving forward in construction and so forth. But before that, you have to get clarity around what is our vision. What is it? Who is it that we want to provide housing for? What part do we want to play now and in the future? How are we going to operate this building? Questions you need to ask from the beginning before you design, build it. And so, that's what took us a long time to get those questions answered, and we think we can help churches to answer those questions much more quickly. And if you don't answer those questions before you start getting into the other pieces, what we often find is you end up doubling back, wasting money and time. And so that's why we're really trying to get people on solid ground before they move ahead and spend a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
You might want to invite Michael Gunter and Rebecca Pousset at some point. They work with Cohere. That for even a small group that's interested, I'm sure they'd be glad to do this, to give you their presentation of getting to base camp, because Michael's just really good at delineating what are the pieces here and what order do they need to come in if you want to think about developing your property.
Okay. Is there anyone else who would like to, has a question?
I was just curious about Patricia's comment in the chat box.
Mm-hmm.
Patricia, just tell us a little bit about what you're working on.
Thank you, Tim. This is something that started 4 years ago. I joined a group predominantly in Coburg, the community 10 kilometers from Port Hope, where I live.
Yep.
And over a period of time, we've become partners, developing a project team composed of Trinity housing people, Trinity United Church, and some of our volunteer groups. So we're incorporated as a nonprofit group. We're just a bunch of people that want to build affordable housings without a faith group connecting us. But I'm a church person, Anglican. Most of the others are not, but they're willing to work with Trinity United people. So it's been great to sort of bridge the divide and bring people together. And we now have a project team. We've got preliminary drawings. We had to sever a lot. We're in the zoning stage. We want to apply to CMHC for help in financing, but Trinity United Church already owns the land.
Yep.
They already operate a 20-unit, 3-story building on existing property next door. So there's a lot of expectations we're going to be funded when we submit our application, because this church has a history of being a good operator of a project. And, the building and the tenants there are evidence of that. And CMHC, just so people know, they only fund projects that bring together a maximum of half the units affordable and the other half at market rent. So mixed income communities. We don't want to ghettoize people living in poverty. It's a very deliberate thing. So what you were talking about, Tim, bringing people with different incomes together, that's the whole idea, to create community. And anyway, so we're going to be net zero, solar on the roof, elevator, barrier-free standards. You know, we want to do it all and do it right. And we would like to also build in Port Hope and other communities. We're trying to follow the county strategy, which says we need 90 new affordable units every year for 10 years in this rural part of Ontario.
Right.
So, but there's so many barriers, and CMHC itself is a barrier. The rules keep changing. Thank you.
A group of citizens and churches working together like that, and even that you've got this far is significant, I think, and so just be encouraged. But we need more. Our imaginations need to be stirred by those stories of how these things can develop. It's great.
Oh, and I've got another question in the chat from Joan. Who manages the housing at Cohere? Is it an organization separate from the church, and how does the ongoing maintenance work?
That's great, Joan. So there are two organizations that are involved in Cohere. One is the foundation that has overseen the development of the project and oversees the project as a whole. But their primary focus is on the physical plant. They hire Salisbury Community Society, which is this society that was developed out of the life of the church, that initially developed community housing and then was an incubator for a number of the other organizations that I mentioned that were developed out of the life of the church. They hire staff, and they have office space in the building, and their role is not to kind of run the building, but to empower the people living there to run their own building. And it's that model that they pursue. And the church stays involved in both those things because they have 3 seats on each of those boards. And most of the people from Salisbury board are part of the church anyway. And so it's quite integrated into the life and vision of the church.
Just to follow up with that, when you're saying they empower the people to run their own building, what is like, so is there a super, or like who does the, you know, if you have a maintenance issue?
Yeah, there is a person
Plumbing or something.
hired that oversees maintenance. But as far as like there's a community builders group that is made up of folks from the building, and the Salisbury staff facilitates those meetings, but is not trying to drive the agenda, but is more trying to equip people with the resources they need to build community in the different ways that they want to. And so there's a weekly community meal that's starting up again now post-COVID, and there's other things, that other groups that take leadership in different aspects of the community life there. So the staff, there are people that are in pretty vulnerable situations, and that's where the staff steps in deeper ways. If a person dealing with mental health in a pretty deep way, then the staff would step in. So the staff is there as a resource for the community.
Well, if there are any other questions, I know that Tim has to leave a little bit early because it's still only coming up to 5 o'clock where he is, and he has another meeting he has to get to. So if anybody had something that they're thinking about and they're like, oh, I wish I could have asked this, please send it to me. My email's at the bottom of that slide there, egolden, Goulden, at toronto.anglican.ca, and I will forward them on to Tim. And Joan has asked if that staffing is like the loft model, and I'm not sure if Tim is familiar with the loft model, but does sound like it has some similarities, but I think loft has different models as well, from what I understand. Loft is a housing provider that did start as Anglican houses in the diocese, out of the diocese years ago. They are more independent now, but they still have a lot of Anglican presence on the board and so forth. And they do have some buildings where they have a staff presence, and they also provide support in, like, for instance, other buildings like Toronto Community Housing and so forth.
Elin,
sounds-
maybe it's worth noting, because this question keeps recurring, that we're in the series, we're going to try to have a session that is dealing specifically with how do you partner with an affordable housing provider. So we can maybe dig more deeply into that question if we find the right person to help us to understand it.
Thanks so much, Jason. Yes, that is the case. We're going to have further sessions. This is just the first of many. Speaking of further sessions, what's next?
I'll have to buy then, if that's okay.
Oh yes, and thank you so much, Tim. And I think we're all really happy that you came tonight and learned a lot, and we're very inspired. And I know I'm going to go look for your books now, because I want to read them. And so it's just been really, really great that you could come.
Thanks, Ellen, and thanks to Jason for inviting me. And Mary and I have been worshiping at the cathedral downtown the last 2 years since I left my role at Grandview, and so we're learning about the Anglican world too, and excited to be with you on this night. So blessings, everyone.
Thank you so much. So in terms of what's next, as mentioned, this is the first of our 4 summer webinar sessions. And so we will be having one every 2 weeks throughout the summer. We are going to have one, the next one will be 2 weeks from tonight on July 21st. Then 2 weeks from that, August 4th, and 2 weeks from that will be August 18th. And as Rob mentioned, we will finalize it and pull everything together with our own kind of getting to base camp session, which will be a Saturday morning session on Saturday, September the 11th. So watch for those. If you attended, registered these, your emails will be saved. So you'll probably be getting an invitation from Lydia to register for the upcoming sessions as well. But you may want to note those dates in your calendar. So our next session on July 21st, 2021, we will be looking at specifically, as Tim was talking about, really listening to your community and listening to what, for whom is the community as it is not working, who is made to feel not to belong. And we're going to be looking at attending to racial equity and reconciliation, Indigenous justice questions as we consider prospective developments. And we have 2 fabulous speakers lined up for that. One is Abigail Mariah. She is a registered planner and consultant, and she's the founder of the Black Planning Project and co-founder of the Mentoring Initiative for Indigenous Black and Planners of Color. Abigail has worked with Toronto Community Housing, New Directions, and a number of other affordable housing, community housing builds. And so we'll look forward to hearing from her. We will also have a presentation from the Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne, who is the Executive Director of First United Church Community Ministry in downtown Vancouver, again, a Vancouver person. Carmen is a member of the Haudenosaunee First Nation, and First United is currently in the process of a major redevelopment of their property, which will feature 103 living units, studio and 1-bedroom apartments, as well as worship space, community space, drop-in centers, legal advocacy clinic, communal dining space. All kinds of things are happening in that project, and it's very exciting, and it's literally reconciliation in action. So really encourage you to come along 2 weeks from tonight and listen to what Abigail and Carmen have to share with us. And that's it for tonight. Thanks everyone for coming, and please come again to our next session and upcoming sessions.